Alright everyone, welcome to your first online lecture component of the Woodworking 1 course. This is Mr. Honke. You'll be hearing my voice over the top of this PowerPoint, and you'll be seeing the PowerPoint itself. I do encourage you, whenever you watch any of these, to take some notes to the recording, during the recording. That will help as we go into the classroom the next day. Another thing just to keep in mind is that you can pause and you can go back and take a look at this again. So if you miss something, then feel free to pause, and then you can just write it down after you go back to it. Also, you can go relive any sort of awkward sentences I may speak over the course of this many times, and I'll be embarrassed, but that's okay. So we'll move along with this. This should take approximately 10 to 12 minutes per video. I'm not going to go any longer than that for the most part, because you don't have a lot of time to be able to listen to these. Make sure that you have headsets. Somehow you're listening to this right now, but make sure you have a headset to listen to this if you're in study hall and so on. Otherwise, you can find this and at any place, at any computer that you have internet. Alright, let's begin. Today we're going to be looking at measuring and marking, and we'll also be looking a little bit at cutting towards the end of the PowerPoint, and also the tools that are involved, the types of cuts, and also specifically the inch, something we will be starting off with more tomorrow. Or we just had this actually, and with looking at the inch, you'll have to become very, very familiar with this unit of measurement, more so than you have in the past. So let's begin. First of all, you have to understand the difference between the two different styles of systems that we have for measurement. The first system is the SI metric system, the Système International system. That system is used by most of the world, but not by people in America, because we have our own system and we're stubborn. America uses the customary system, the inch, the foot, the yard, and the mile, as opposed to the metric. The metric is based on 10. America is based on 12 or 5,280 or 3 or whatever. It just has to become something that you get used to, rather than something that makes necessarily lots of sense. Especially for international students, this will be a little bit more of a challenge. Taking a look at the inch. The inch is something you should be pretty familiar with. You know, by the way, this is not actual size. It varies according to the size of your computer. This particular inch is broken down constantly in half. That's how the inch measurements work, and that's how we designate things. So we start on the right hand side. We have 1 inch here, and of course we divide that in half. Once it's divided in half, we are now at half an inch. You divide that in half, and we are at a quarter of an inch. You divide that in half, and you're at an eighth, and then at a 16th. You can keep dividing if you want to. Usually in our world you go down to a 32nd at best, but usually you would just say something like this thing is 3 1/16 wide, or 3 1/16 shy, or 3 1/16 long, just to kind of designate whereabouts that exact measurement is. If you were to climb from 0 up, you would start like this: 1/16, 1/8. Now you could call it 2/16, but of course you need to simplify as you do in math, and you need to not sound like an idiot when you're talking to somebody else and they say, how long is that? And you say, well, it's 3 feet 1 8/16 inches long. No, that would not make any sense. You would instead say 3 feet 1 and 1.5. So as we go up, make note that we are simplifying constantly. So 1/16, 1/8, 3/16, 1/4, 5/16, 3/8, 7/16, 1/2, 9/16, 5/8, 11/16, 3/4, 13/16, 7/8, 15/16, and 1. It will become more familiar with you the more you use it, the more you recognize lengths of things. But just keep in mind that the shorter the line, the bigger the denominator of the number, which is of course the number on the bottom there. We'll practice more with that tomorrow though. Now there are different types of rules you should become familiar with. I'll put up 4 here on the screen, and I'll show them to you in class as well. You need to get familiar with them, number 1, because these are the types of rules you'll be using in woodworking, and number 2, because you need to be able to get an A on your quiz, which will be coming up, and which will be based on these pictures, this PowerPoint, you interacting with this stuff in class, and also what you'll find in the Woodworker's Handbook, pages 16 and onward in your book. That will be part of the quiz, so you can reference these right now if you so choose, and they'll give you a little bit of a rundown of what each one of these does. Starting in the upper left-hand corner, we've got ourselves the folding wooden rule. The folding wooden rule is something that you may find in, like, for example, your grandparents' workshop, something that's very common back in the day before tape measures became very, very popular. Very helpful rule. It can do a lot of different things for people who know how to use it, but we are primarily not going to be using this rule in class. Underneath that is a type of rule we will be using. This is called the bench rule. The bench rule is a flat piece of metal, and this particular rule right here you can see is metric. We're going to be using ones that use the American system, the customary system. We'll be introduced to those very soon, if not already. Up here we have calipers. Calipers are used oftentimes in machining as well as industrial applications. Also can be used for woodworking to be able to transfer marks and check for sizes. This would be an external calipers to check the outside fit of something. This would be internal to check the space between something. And down over here we have ourselves a tape measure, not used as much in woodworking one, more so in building construction. Of course, we're more familiar with that one, most likely. We've also got a number of types of squares, and these squares that we find on this page, upper left-hand corner, we'll start with that. That's a speed square, a Swanson speed square that was created. The name was created. It's kind of like Kleenex and tissues became, the brand became part of the name because it became so popular. That is used more in building construction applications. We'll be using the one on the upper right-hand corner often. This is called a tri-square, as well as the one in the lower left-hand corner right here. This is called a combination square. A combination square does several different things for us, including measuring 45-degree angles as you place it against there, 90-degree angles, and doing measurement. Bottom right-hand corner right here, we see a framing square or a carpenter square. Can be called either one. That is usually larger. 2 feet by 1 foot is very typical. This one ends up being 12 by 8, it looks like. But can be very big squares, a little bit boxy, but can be used also for woodworking applications. And finally, this thing right here, this is a wing nut that can adjust this. This particular tool called a sliding T-bevel. This can transfer angles from one thing to another, so you can have that cut done perfectly. Also a very, very common woodworker's tool. That's how you measure, that's how you create square, and here's how you mark. You use your marking tools. The first marking tool we have is, of course, a pencil. Pencils are things that are very useful not only in school but also in the wood shop, because they work very well with wood and can be erased off of wood just like they can be erased off of paper, so that when we stain things, they're gone. Much more useful than a pen, although a pen can be used at times to get very, very fine marks if you use a ballpoint pen. But more so, I much more recommend a pencil, and inside of the wood shop you are to always use a pencil. The big, thick, chunky pencils you see right here on the screen, this section and a couple of these are called carpenter's pencils, and they do not break the tips as often as do the other ones. But a very finely sharpened regular pencil can be invaluable for your woodworking. One thing you also will need to be able to use is a utility knife. That's how we sharpen our pencils. And you can also make marks with a utility knife because it's got that sharp blade, and make a very fine mark with that as long as you are sure that's your mark. Finally, you can also use a scratch awl. I'll show you what that is in class tomorrow. A scratch awl has a bulbous end made out of wood, and it's got a section of metal in the tip that scratches the wood and makes marks that way. Now, when we measure with our measurement devices and mark with our pencil and other marking devices, we have to measure a certain way that has become just common use, and that is how we end up designating all of the different sizes of things. When you measure, the key is T by W by L. It's not a long equation. It's just you start with the thickness of the piece of wood, then you go to the width, then finally you end up with a length. So in this particular piece of wood here, the thickness is the end grain, and you can see in the end grain there's a little dado cut. This is a piece of car siding that has a tongue and groove, and this particular piece of car siding would probably be around 3/4 of an inch thick, so that would be the T. Then you take and figure out the width. The width is across the face, what you would call, of the piece of wood, and the length, of course, is the biggest number. That's going to be how long that is here. So in this case, as an estimate, this is probably 3/4 by maybe 5.5, and maybe it's 6 feet long, just as an example. Just to write that out, you would write 3/4 by 6.5 inches by, and then you'd probably not use length with feet. You'd probably instead use 72 inches, but you say by 72 inches there. We will practice that in class tomorrow as well. Alright, and finally, to finish us up for this particular PowerPoint, you have to understand the different types of cuts that are made. We'll be doing those coming up very soon, if we haven't already started with these. Your types of cuts are fourfold, and your things to cut with are found on the right-hand side of the screen right there. 4 main types of cuts are these: cross cut, rip cut, miter cut, bevel cut. Write these down. You will definitely want to remember these. Very important. And it has to deal with the grain of the wood. So when you look at the grain, you need to be able to read it appropriately. And by reading it, I mean understand where the grain is going, where the end of the grain is, where you are across the grain, and so on. A cross cut goes across the grain. As you can see right here, it's crossing the grain pattern, the lines that run on the wood. A rip cut, on the other hand, it's pointing right to this dashed line right here, runs with the grain of the wood. A miter cut runs on an angle on the face, so it's across the grain for the most part, but it's on an angle. It's kind of in between the rip and the cross cut. And a bevel is different than all of those. That's angled to the edge of the wood. These can be a rip cut or a cross cut. So if you were to angle to the cross, it would end up with this edge right here being beveled on an angle. If you were to rip a bevel cut, it would be this whole edge here on an angle. So this would be an end angle, and this would be an edge angle. Those 4 cuts are very important to know, because I'll be speaking in those terms as we go along, the types of cuts you have to make. To make those cuts, there's a number of different hand saws you can use. You can start with a crosscut saw, these larger saws. Here's a very big crosscut saw with big kerfs, or big gaps between the blades. And then you have a coping saw for cutting curves, a back saw for very fine work, and finally a keyhole saw that can also be used for cutting curves. That's as far as I'm going to go for this particular video. We will look at more tomorrow, including exactly how to cut safely, different tips and techniques, and also some practice with back saws, crosscut saws, and if you have the chance, maybe even the crosscut saw. Thanks for listening to your first video, and I hope everything went well as you listened to it.